Now we're going to be shifting gears, and we're going to be talking about Greater Israel.
Ooh, yeah.
So when I say Greater Israel, what currently springs into your imagination?
I mean, are you looking at me? Yeah,
Now let's hear from Shajil first.
Greater Israel. It means you are going all the way to Saudi Arabia, taking over Tabuk.
Mm-hmm.
You know, on the outskirts of Medina, Medina al-Munawwara, and then expanding up to Lebanon, and then all those Levantine regions. Right. That's what Greater Israel is, and that's what Israel is lobbying for.
That's what you think.
No, that's what I think. No, I don't think so.
I don't think that I don't think anyone's lobbying for it.
Yeah, no, I'm just.
We'll display the map on the screen,
Yeah,
right? But when we were in Saudi Arabia, our friend who we met with is concerned. So the idea about having like Jewish tourists one day in the Tabuk region to go see what is probably historic Mount Sinai,
right?
Like freaked him out because it's like, well, there's this kind of Greater Israel thing that's kind of in the works,
right?
And people will actually say the two blue stripes on the Israeli flag are the Nile and the Euphrates.
That's crazy. Yeah, that's an Arafat thing. Like that was and he was the one who introduced that. So yeah.
So let me put it this way. So you guys are saying there is nowhere, no people in Israel or the supporters of Israel believe in what is commonly believed in Muslim world.
Can I make an analogy? Okay. I have lots of Mexican friends, right? And some of the Mexican friends I talk to are like, no, California, Texas, like, maybe even Oklahoma, Nevada, and Arizona are definitely ours. And it was taken from us, right? So, it should go back to Mexico. And there were even protests like not that long ago about that. Does every Mexican feel that way? No way. Does the Mexican government feel that way? I don't think so. So I think, if you're going to compare it, like that's a fair comparison because, I mean, I know I have friends in Israel who don't even like that they're in Gaza, much less like, we're gonna march into Jordan and take it,
and
like,
Iraq,
and Iraq. You know what I mean? Like we're just gonna increase this area. So I don't see it. I know that there are like certain people throughout history have wanted this and called for it, but I think it's a lot like it reminds me a lot about like the situation in Mexico. Or let's just take a Middle Eastern example, right? Iran believes that a chunk of the UAE belongs to it.
Yes.
Right? And will act militarily to try and enforce that. So, the UAE doesn't respond with force or whatever, but it's still a thing of contention. So there are people in Iran who believe like, no, that should be ours.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last point is like, what happens in a caliphate? What happens to Turkey in a caliphate? What happens to Jordan? They are erased, right? Like there are no more borders anymore in a caliphate. The whole thing is an Islamic state. So, or like a khalifa. So, I see like this kind of like, no, they're trying to take over the entire world, and they're going to make a land grab like to increase the size of the country to, I don't know how big is that? Europe? I mean,
yeah, there are many holes in this narrative itself, right? Of like Greater Israel. I'll go over it, but I think you got to say something.
So another Muslim example would be like Muslims like longing for the days of Al-Andalus.
Right. Al-Andalus, yes.
Right. So it was part of historic Muslim territory. And if you ask lots of Muslims, should Al-Andalus be returned to the Muslims, and be like, yeah, absolutely. Inshallah, right? But if you actually try to get people together to like make a plan like of that, like the government of Morocco is not
interested in
like governing Spain, right?
Yes. Even they are. Spain is not allowing them to do so.
But there's two elements of that. Like I'm sure there are like extremist Israelis who would like that. But I think it's really, really important to understand the sort of Greater Israel map is not even a biblical map.
No.
At the highest extent of Israel's influence and territory, it was not that. But let's
Well, some people will point to a coin, right, that has the map, that area highlighted in it, and like they want to point to like a specific time period where that might have had more steam among some people. But if anything, the opposite has happened. Like the country's gotten smaller, not bigger.
So let's look at the biblical basis for this, because what people are referencing here is, on that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I'll give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Kedemites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. So what he's saying is, Abraham's territory and the territory of his descendants will go from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates. So people can,
And a lot of people think that that's the Nile,
yeah,
and particularly people who are like pro the greater Israel.
Pro expansion.
Yeah, I mean, that. Yeah, don't even get me started on that. I mean, I see the reading, and I could see where it's like, all right, you're either talking about like a little stream somewhere in Egypt, or you're talking about the Euphrates, right? And which one is it? Like, is it the Euphrates? I don't like, if you follow Abraham's journey, right? So everywhere the sole of your foot treads, I'll give to you and your offspring as an inheritance, right? You and your descendants as an inheritance. And the journey of Abraham takes place and starts in Ur of the Chaldees, goes down all the way through Canaan, and then into Egypt, right? And then comes back, and then he settles in Beersheba, like the south, Hebron and all that other stuff. So that journey is what a lot of people point to and say, well, look at where he came from, right? Like essentially Iraq, and then walked over and then came all the way down through the land of Canaan, along the Jordan and all that other stuff, and then into Egypt and stayed there. And that's where the whole thing happened with his wife, right? And then coming back in. So let's point at that, right? And say, along with what you were talking about, that's in Joshua, right?
that what I read was in Genesis.
In Genesis. Okay. So it's also repeated in Joshua chapter 1.
Yeah, but I'll also make a point here, going back to when they talk about Greater Israel, we have to see through the reality what exists in front of us right now. And the reality is Jews and Muslims don't get along. Yeah, right. So Jews, even though they're so close, they're cousins in terms of the religious similarities, in terms of like monotheism and the way that the certain practices are, and so on and so forth, like not eating pork and stuff. So they're so close, but they're so distant far. It's like cousins fighting and they become worst enemies. It's kind of like that. Yeah. So thinking of like Israel expanding and incorporating more Arab countries to it.
Like, why?
And
why would you do that?
And you can't erase them, right? It's very simple.
I mean, what are you going to do? There are like 15 million Jews in the whole world. What are you going to offset like a billion Muslims?
Right.
So basically, I'm going to argue that prophecy to Abraham came true under David and Solomon. Okay. So there's two. One, the promise to Abraham and his descendants, which, could plausibly include Arabs too, right? Doesn't necessarily mean it's only Israel, but I think the proper reading is Israel there. Mm-hmm. Even that, it doesn't say it takes over all of Iraq, it just goes to the Euphrates. So under King Solomon, this is what it says. And so in Joshua, the northernmost city is Dan. The southernmost city is Beersheba, right?
And that is the classical, like from Dan to
Beersheba. From Dan to Beersheba.
Yeah.
Listen to how 1 Kings 4 describes Solomon's kingdom. Judah and Israel were as many as the sand by the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. So so the border of Egypt, not the Nile, the border of Egypt. So you read that with the river of Egypt as the Wadi in Sinai, right? Would make more sense there. Sure. Because again, ancient Egyptian and Hebrew do not have a name for the river Nile. The Egyptians just called it the river because it's kind of like, the one they all think of.
Sure.
And what does it mean that he's ruling over them? They're paying him tribute, right? That he's the hegemon in the region. So then it says, in 24, it says, for he had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates, from Tiphash to Gaza, over all the kings west of the Euphrates, and he had peace on all sides around him. And Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan even to Beersheba, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, all the days of Solomon. So notice there's a distinction there, right? The way he rules to the Euphrates is through their kind of client states paying him tribute. They recognize him as the sort of the overlord of the area. But what it's not doing is expanding the borders of the people of Israel to those places, right? The Philistines are still the Philistines. The Syrians are still the Syrians. They have peace and tribute paid to Solomon, right?
Right.
And the people of Israel and Judah, where are they? Dan to Beersheba, right?
Right.
There's no Israelis settling Damascus.
Sure.
And that's
Saudi Arabia
or Saudi Arabia. And again, there's nothing in the biblical description that would even hint that it goes into Saudi Arabia.
Right. I mean, if you look at like Isaiah 19, right? So in Isaiah 19, it's a prophecy about Egypt. And it talks about one day that there will be a like a calamity that happens in Egypt, and the Egyptians will fight each other, and then they'll lose heart, and then they'll consult idols and everything else like that. But then the waters of the river, the Nile, will dry up, and the riverbed will be parched and dry. The canals will stink. The streams of Egypt will dwindle and dry up. And, it goes on like to talk about how there are no wise people left in Egypt, right? They're just people fighting each other, over consulting over idols and fighting each other. And then what winds up happening is, in that day, the Egyptians will become weaklings. This is verse 16. They will shudder with fear at the uplifted hand that the Lord Almighty raises against them. And the land of Judah will bring terror to the Egyptians. Everyone whom Judah is mentioned will be terrified because of what the Lord Almighty is planning against them. In that day, 5 cities in Egypt will speak the language of Canaan and swear allegiance to the Lord Almighty. One of them will be called the City of the Sun. That would be Alexandria. In that day, there will be an altar to the Lord in the heart of Egypt and a monument to the Lord at its border. It will be a sign and witness to the Lord Almighty in the land of Egypt. When they cry out to the Lord because of their oppressors, he will send them a savior and a defender, and he will rescue them. So the Lord will make himself known to the Egyptians, and in that day they will acknowledge the Lord. They will worship with sacrifices and grain offerings. They will make vows to the Lord and keep them. So it talks about a little later, like a highway going from Egypt to Assyria, right? And Assyria to Egypt. And then it talks about how the Egyptians and the Assyrians will worship together. And then in verse 24, it says, in that day, Israel will be the third, along with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing on the earth. The Lord Almighty will bless them. Blessed be Egypt, my people, Assyria, my handiwork, and Israel, my inheritance. So you have 3 countries that are being included in language that comes out of the Abrahamic covenant, right? I look at that passage and I say the only way that can happen is some sort of Christian revival, right? Like, because in the current flesh, it's not going to happen. They're not just going to start worshiping, they're not going to turn into Zionists. You know what I mean?
Right.
And then the other thing that happens within that text is that's a very big area, but everyone still has their sovereignty, right? Like Assyria, we don't know. What is Assyria? So Assyria in the time of Isaiah is half of Turkey, goes all the way over to Iraq, down through Jordan, and then back over. So it's pretty much all of the Levant, right? That is the Assyrian Empire at the time. So what the prophecy is saying is that something's going to happen in Egypt. It's going to be like it's going to cause a major calamity, and the country will experience some kind of supernatural revival that draws them to the God of Israel. And again, to be included in the Abrahamic covenant like that, right? To use those specific words, those words are intentional, right? My handiwork, my inheritance. You know, those are things that he says about Israel, the only country that he has a covenant with, right? The only nation, the only people he has like a direct covenant with. So, that being said, if you were to look at all of that in context, right, there is a time when there will be mutual cooperation between, you know, three world powers at that point, right? And that highway that they talk about is essentially like if you've ever been in New York City, you can see this lane. You know, it's called the road, and it just kind of, you walk all through Chelsea and you walk down above things. It's an elevated area where, you know, it goes over top of all of these lands and connects these places. But I think, like, if you can read into that in the normal sense, it's, you know, information, right? It's economic, it's spiritual, you know, like passage between these places. So there are still Egyptians, there are still Assyrians, right? And Assyrians in that time would, if you were to look at that map today, it would be like Turkey and Jordanians and Iraqis and Kurds, right? And like different groups of people, all cooperating like that.
It's the expansion of the Gulf Cooperation Council under the name of Jesus.
Yeah. I'll make a point, though, if you allow. You mentioned the state of Israel, right? The present state of Israel. What's Christian point of view on state of Israel? Is God established state of Israel? Does God back state of Israel? Because in my opinion, I do not consider the state of Israel as a holy appointee. And why I don't do so, because there are things that state of Israel has done that does not reflect God, I would say.
So let me make my minimalist case for this. So, firstly, not only do I believe that God has sovereignly established the state of Israel, I also believe that God has sovereignly established every single state on the planet, including Saudi Arabia, including Kuwait, including Jordan, including Syria, right? So ultimately, the Bible teaches that God determines the boundary places of people's habitations. So I believe that God has a plan for Israel, including the modern state of Israel. That is not the same thing as endorsing every single action of the modern state of Israel. Like, I have high expectations for what God is going to do for the state of Israel in the future, in the same way I have high expectations about what God is going to do for Saudi Arabia. And I believe Israel is central to God's plan, but it's not central to the exclusion of all the other countries in the Middle East.
Right.
As I was describing before, right? This is something that's entirely beneficial to those people, right? They keep their own identities, they keep their own cultures, yet they're walking hand in hand with Israel. So I believe God's plan is to reveal himself to all the Arab nations, and God will use, and they'll become Christian in large part. And then those Arab Christians will bring the gospel to Israel, and then they'll all become Christians. Those are my political views.
Nice. I like that political.
There's a verse in the 66th chapter of Isaiah, so it's the final chapter, right? And it's a very famous chapter because it says, like, heaven is the earth, and the earth is my footstool. Heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. And God is talking about the end of all things, right? He's talking about how he will reign supreme over all the earth. Okay. And there is in verse 7, it talks about, before she goes into labor, she will give birth. Before the pains come upon her, she delivers a son. Who has ever heard of such things? Who has ever seen things like this? Can a country be born in a day, or a nation be brought forth in a moment? No sooner is Zion in labor that she gives birth to her children. Do I bring the moment of birth and not give delivery, says the Lord? Do I close up the womb when I bring the delivery, says your God? Rejoice with Jerusalem and be glad with her, all you who love her. Rejoice greatly with her, all you who mourn over her. So a lot of people, and I mean, I would have a hard time disproving this. I mean, in light of like the way that people have looked at the Bible from 70 AD and the destruction of Jerusalem to like 48, 47, 48, right? Like 1947, 1948, that it was in one day. Like, sure, there was a process leading up to it, but there was a vote and then there was a state. and then like that prophecy is included in a long string of things that God is saying about the end times, right? And at the very end of the chapter, it's exactly how the book of Revelation ends, right? So people have pointed to this and said it's like Israel's like a prophetic thermometer, right? The state of Israel is like a prophetic thermometer. That's not endorsing anybody. That's not saying the state is valid in the things that it does or the decisions that it makes. That's not even the state saying the state is aligned with God at that moment, at this current moment, right? Because again, in Israel, they practice things that are abomination to Torah. So, but that doesn't mean that God doesn't have plans for it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's it. That's it. Right. We
That's
don't.
it.
We don't. That doesn't require us to endorse everything Israel does.
Sure.
It certainly wouldn't make us endorse Israel militarily conquering, a fictional greater Israel map that doesn't exist.
Right.
But it does mean we're praying for Israel's future.
Right.
We're hopeful for Israel's future, and we want to see Israelis acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah in the same way we want to see the same thing for Saudis, for Egyptians, for Assyrians,
Sure.
and including the Palestinians too.
Sure.
And we want to see everybody prosper.